You bravely state this was your first exposure to love as well as sex.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, the reason I decided to put that in is two things. One, yes, it's about love. And in my case, a sort of first love. And second, because so many people I know could put this in their memoirs or their accounts of themselves and don't. And so at a time when homosexuality is being partly criminalized by people in the country where I live, in the United States, or it's being very much defamed, I thought it might be a good thing if more people said, come on, a lot of people know at least a bit about what it's like to be gay. Don't let's pretend it's a minority thing just. So it was a form of solidarity, in a way, and I think the way I put it is to say that homosexuality is a form of love as well as a form of sex, and deserves respect in that way, for that reason.
Yeah, so it had a serious, you thought you needed to say that.
Yes.
That you should actually force yourself
whereas if I said,
to put it down, is that
whereas if I said I once had a girlfriend who's now very famous because she's the editor of a well-known women's magazine and so on, and some reviewers have pointed this out, I couldn't really see why that would be so interesting. And well, we began with insecurity. One of my insecurities is I'm terrified of being boring, as I'm terrified of being bored. So I thought anything that's only put in perhaps to make me look good or for its own sake, I can't be sure I'd hold the reader's attention.
Oh, look, I'm sure you're holding the reader's attention most of the time, particularly through that chapter. Let's go to your actual political life, because it's still unclear as to what prompted you to become a young socialist in the first place.
Well, in the time of their lives when many people feel they're in rebellion, they're often rebels without a cause, I suppose, and at that time in my life, we were rebels with a cause. I mean, if you were my age, 18, 19, in 1968, you really did feel, and actually I still do, that you were living through a revolutionary year, if not epoch. And it's a feeling I hope to try and convey. You be the judge of whether I do or not.
But part of that year, 68, yeah. I think you were in Cuba, in fact, on a sort of revolutionary holiday camp, when you heard about...
No, work camp.
Work camp, indeed. When you heard about this, was the invasion of Czechoslovakia,
yes,
and the tanks, Soviet tanks rolling through the streets of Prague. Now, was that some kind of turning point?
Well, it was every kind of turning point, because I was already involved in an argument within the left. It wasn't just the left versus the right, or the insurgent generation versus the establishment. It was a big fight within the left, among other things, about Stalinism. And I was a member of what's loosely called a Trotskyist or Luxemburgist group, and we had big fights with other parties and other factions, and these took place in the mountains of Cuba. It's very real to me still, and it was given huge density by the confrontation over Czechoslovakia. And I remember thinking, when we heard early in the morning that the Warsaw Pact had invaded, taken over Prague, this is actually the end of official communism. I was as sure of it as I could have been.
Why wasn't it the end of official communism in 1956, when the same tanks effectively went into Budapest and crushed the Budapest Spring?
I would already have argued that, yeah, but I wasn't there for 56. It is actually one of the first things I remember. I was 7. My deductive powers were not what they've since become, or declined from being. But
no, but you were great friends with Robert Conquest,
yes,
and others who must have tried to encourage you to think about it.
What I'd read about it in the meantime would have convinced me that it was over. Well, some would have said it was over with the Moscow trials. You could as easily have said that. But I could only describe in my memoir what the bits that I saw myself.
Yeah.
Just as when I go to Iraq, as I do several times in the book, I can only say what I saw myself. I don't tell the whole history of Baathism.
I'm going to come to that. Let's go to one woman who does get an admiring reference in your memoir, surprisingly to many, Margaret Thatcher.
And a sexual one too, if I can say that.
And a sexual one.
Finally say that for myself.
I'd like to get you to describe that frisson, if I can. But
yes.
By the time you met her, or at the time you met her, you were just starting, it appears, to doubt your leftist politics. And you described Thatcherism as the rodent slowly stirring in my viscera.
Yes. Well, at the time, I considered myself to be a dedicated member of the Labour movement, on the side of the working class internationally, thinking as a socialist that the working class could acquire the faculties of becoming the ruling class. I remember that very clearly, and I wouldn't have anyone ridicule it. It was a real feeling. But in the area in which I worked, which is the print and journalism industry in London, there was no doubt that the most reactionary, most corrupt, most backward force was the trade unions. I mean, the print media unions in those days, it was a racket, really. It was mobbed up. So that was a big contradiction to be living with. And Thatcher said, the unions have too much power in the workplace. They're a restraint on production and on innovation and new investment and so on. I thought,
and you started to think maybe Thatcher had some actual points.
Where I worked, that's true. And then I went and met the...
Yes, tell us about that. I mean, it's a pretty remarkable meeting. It's one of the more interesting anecdotes.
Well, when she was elected leader of the opposition, the majority view in the press, including not much of the Tory press, the pro-Ted Heath press, was she's a shrill, right-wing, suburban housewife, she'll never get anywhere, she's unelectable, the Tories have gone temporarily crazy. And I thought, I'm not sure this is true. She has something. I'm not quite sure what it is. I wrote a profile of her for the New York Times in which I said I thought she had some sexual charm. Never got as laughed at in my life as for saying that. Anyway, I went to meet her at a reception in the House of Bloody Lords. And we got into an argument about Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. No, I was right, she was wrong, doesn't matter. But I bowed to acknowledge, well, at least you've argued well, sort of thing. And she said, no, bow lower. I could still hear it, and I sort of bowed a bit further. Completely volitionless. I just did what she said. And she said, no, no, much lower. So I was bent almost double. And she'd been rolling up parliamentary order paper behind her back and stepped forward and smote me on the bottom with it, like that, and said, you're a naughty boy. And anyone who's read their English public school mythology will know something of what's going on here. So I straightened up with some difficulty. Can't remember how I got out of there, frankly. But later, as she picked off her male opponents one by one, unerringly, brilliantly, I remember thinking, I sort of saw that coming.
It's really quite shocking to think that may well have been the moment when you changed from the left to somewhere closer to Thatcherism. I'm going to jump forward. We've got
a little simplistic.
I have oversimplified it enormously. Now, let's quickly go to Iraq. We haven't got much time left, but I had similar reasons to yours for wanting to see regime change in Iraq. But after seeing the inevitable consequences of war, I mean, the Iraqi civilian deaths in particular, but also the destruction of property and society, one has to doubt the reasons for war, for even supporting a war. And I'm wondering, did you have any doubt whatsoever when you started to see the death toll of civilians mounting?
If you put it like that, my reply might seem needlessly harsh, but not on that, no, because the civilian casualties were being exacted by the horrible pornographic alliance that still operates and is still killing civilians, even as the United States is withdrawing, of Al-Qaeda and the Ba'ath Party. I'm not to be blamed.
Many of them were, but we're talking of the minimum figure now is 100,000 plus civilians, and they weren't all killed by...
All of it is liable to the charge of, first of the Saddam plus sanctions regime, which was killing civilians by the tens of thousands before the intervention, which was put a stop to by the removal of the sanctions and the removal of the regime. And then the appalling unholy alliance of goons and gangsters and Islamic terrorists since, which also created the disruption in supplies, services and so on, that leads to people dying of non-violent causes. No, I mean, I absolutely won't have it said that the fault of the violence, the deliberate violence and disruption comes from any other source, but the impeachable criminal incompetence of the Bush administration in its post-war planning is a whole other story. I try to tell some of it in my book, the realization that I'd been asking the wrong questions before the war began.
Well, indeed, and
I should have been pressing those. I presume we can turn the lights on in Baghdad, that the Army Corps of Engineer has basic competence. I didn't think it was my job to ask that. I thought other people were more qualified. That's what I should have been asking.
A final question. Is there...
I don't forgive myself for that.
Is there or should there be, when one advocates for a war, a kind of moral mathematics where you actually balance out the deaths against the advantage?
Well, one has to be a bit more than just a utilitarian, I think, because you're never going to know in advance how to calculate greatest happiness versus greatest number versus casualties. You rightly say certain consequences of war are inevitable, but no, predictable, measurable incompetence of the sort that one had the right to assume wouldn't be the case in an Anglo-American intervention was disastrous, and I don't think will ever be forgiven by the Iraqi people or anyone who considers himself to be their friend.
Christopher Hitchens, I'm sorry to say we're out of time. It always happens. We could talk for at least twice this length of time without even denting what needs to be asked. But we thank you very much for coming in to talk to us.
Well, it's been real. Thank you.